A wind begins to rise from the east, not loud enough to shake the world at first, but heavy enough to stir something deep in the hearts of those who are paying attention. It moves across lands that once carried empires, knowledge, and battles that shaped entire generations. And for those who have studied the words of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, this direction is not unfamiliar. It has been mentioned before, hinted at, connected to events that would unfold near the end of time. The question is not just what is happening, but what it could mean. Because when something begins in the East, especially from lands once known as Persia and Khorasan, it carries echoes of narrations that have been preserved for centuries. Could this be nothing more than another chapter of history? Or could it be something far greater? Something tied to the long-awaited moment that believers have spoken about for generations. Before we go any further, take a moment with me. If this topic speaks to you, if you are someone who seeks truth and wants to understand Islam deeply, then let me know where you are watching from, because this message travels across borders and hearts alike. And if you value content that strengthens your connection to Islam, then stay with this journey and be part of a growing community that reflects, learns, and prepares together. To understand any discussion about signs, especially something as powerful as events in the East, we must first ground ourselves in what is absolutely clear and firmly established. At the center of this discussion is a man whose arrival is not a myth, not a legend, but a reality affirmed by the words of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Al-Mahdi is not a figure shaped by imagination. He is described with precision, with clarity, and with a purpose that connects directly to the condition of the world before his arrival. He will come at a time when injustice spreads across the earth, when oppression becomes so normal that people begin to lose hope in fairness and truth. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described him as a man from his own lineage, from the descendants of Fatima. May Allah be pleased with her. His name will match the name of the prophet, and his father's name will match the father of the prophet. These are not vague descriptions. They are clear identifiers, meant to prevent confusion and false claims. But what makes his arrival even more powerful is not just who he is, but how he appears. That he will not emerge with armies announcing him, nor will he stand and declare himself with authority that demands belief. Instead, people will recognize him gradually. They will see in him qualities that match what they have learned. They will see sincerity, justice, and a firmness upon truth that cannot be faked. There is even a narration that describes how he will initially not seek leadership, and yet people will come to him and give him allegiance, even if he hesitates. This alone tells us something profound. The Mahdi is not a political figure chasing power. He is a servant of Allah, placed into a position of responsibility at a time when the world desperately needs it. And this is where many people make a mistake. They focus so much on external signs that they forget the internal reality. And the appearance of the Mahdi is not just about events unfolding in the world. It is about the condition of the people, the level of injustice, the depth of division, and the readiness of hearts to accept guidance. Without that context, even the clearest sign could be misunderstood. This is why scholars have always emphasized that the signs must be understood as a complete picture, not isolated fragments taken out of context. Now we come to one of the most talked about elements in this entire discussion, the black banners from the East. This narration has traveled far, repeated in gatherings, shared in discussions, and often connected to modern events without careful verification. The wording that many people quote speaks about black banners emerging from the East, and that among them will be the Mahdi, and that believers should go to them even if it requires great effort. It is a powerful image, one that immediately captures attention. A movement rising from the East, carrying a banner, advancing with purpose. It sounds like something unmistakable. But this is where knowledge must guide emotion. Not every narration that is widely known is strongly authenticated. Scholars of Hadith have carefully studied these reports, examining their chains of transmission, comparing narrators, and analyzing consistency. And when it comes to the narration about black banners in this specific wording, there is a difference of opinion. It is not found in the most authentic collections like Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim with that exact clear connection. Some scholars have considered parts of these narrations to be weak, while others have mentioned supporting chains that give them some level of credibility, but not to the level of absolute certainty. This does not mean the narration is false beyond discussion, but it does mean we cannot treat it as a definitive, unquestionable sign. And this distinction is critical, because once people treat something uncertain as certain, they begin to interpret every event through that lens. Every movement in the East becomes a possible fulfillment. Every conflict becomes a sign, and before long, confusion replaces clarity. What adds another layer to this discussion is history itself. Black banners have appeared before. Movements have risen from the East, carrying that exact symbol. The most well-known example is the Abbasid revolution, which began in the region of Khorasan. Now they marched under black banners and eventually overthrew the Umayyad dynasty. At that time, many believed that this was the fulfillment of the narrations. It looked convincing. It matched the description in appearance. But the Mahdi did not emerge in the way the authentic narrations describe. History continued, and the expected outcome did not take place. This teaches a lesson that cannot be ignored. Similarity does not equal fulfillment. Just because something looks like a sign does not mean it is the sign. And if this mistake happened in the past, at a time closer to the early generations, then it is even more important for people today to be cautious. So when we hear about events in Persia or movements rising from the East, we should not rush to conclusions. We should not dismiss them either, but we must approach them with balance. We return to what is authentic. We measure everything against what is firmly established. And we remind ourselves that the signs of the end times are not meant to turn believers into speculators chasing headlines, but into people who are grounded, aware, and prepared. Because when the real moment comes, it will not rely on guesswork. It will not depend on interpretation alone. It will align clearly with what the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described. And those who have taken the time to understand the difference between strong evidence and weak claims will not be confused when that moment arrives. If we step back from speculation and look at history with calm, disciplined eyes, something fascinating begins to unfold. The idea of black banners rising from the East is not something people only talk about today. For it has already appeared once in a very real and very powerful way, and understanding that moment is essential if we want to avoid repeating the same confusion. Centuries ago, from the lands known as Khorasan, a movement began to grow quietly. It did not start as a global force. It started as a call, a gathering of support, a slow build of momentum that eventually turned into something unstoppable. And when that movement marched, it carried black banners, not symbols imagined later, not stories added afterward, but real banners seen by people, recorded by historians, and tied directly to one of the biggest political transformations in early Islamic history. This was the Abbasid revolution. At that time, the Muslim world was already facing deep tension. There was dissatisfaction with leadership, a sense of injustice felt by many, and a growing divide among people. When the Abbasid movement rose from the East, it seemed to fit the descriptions that some had heard in narrations. Black banners, rising from Khorasan, moving with strength, challenging the existing order. For many, it felt undeniable. It looked like prophecy unfolding in front of their eyes. People began to believe that this was the moment, that this was connected to the awaited figure they had heard about. Some even aligned themselves with the movement based on that belief, convinced that they were witnessing the fulfillment of something sacred. But what happened next is what matters most. The Abbasids succeeded politically. They overthrew the Umayyad dynasty and established their rule. Power shifted, leadership changed, and a new era began. Yet the Mahdi, as described in the authentic narrations, did not emerge in that time in the way that had been clearly outlined by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. The deeper, unmistakable signs did not align. The transformation that was promised, the filling of the earth with justice after it had been filled with oppression, did not manifest in the complete and profound way described in the Hadith. Life continued, history moved forward, and what many had assumed to be the final chapter turned out to be just another page. This moment in history is not just a story to be remembered. It is a lesson that should shape how we think today. Because the pattern is clear. A movement arises. It carries elements that resemble narrations. People connect it to prophecy. Expectations rise. And then reality unfolds differently. The mistake was not in observing the similarity. The mistake was in turning possibility into certainty without clear, authentic proof. This is exactly why scholars throughout generations have warned against rushing to label events as signs of the end times without strong evidence. They understood that once people become convinced of something uncertain, it can lead to disappointment, confusion, and even division. And when we connect this historical lesson to the present, it becomes even more relevant. Today, information spreads faster than ever. A single claim can reach millions within hours. A single interpretation can shape how entire communities think. So when people hear about movements in the East, when they see political shifts or conflicts in regions once known as Persia or Khorasan, it is easy to fall into the same pattern. The imagery feels familiar. The language sounds similar. The connection seems tempting. But history is quietly reminding us to slow down, to think carefully, and to separate what is confirmed from what is assumed. Now, when we speak about Persia itself, we are not speaking about an ordinary land with no significance. Persia holds a unique and deeply respected place in Islamic tradition. It is not just a geographical location. It is a region that has contributed immensely to the intellectual, spiritual, and scholarly heritage of Islam. Some of the greatest scholars in Islamic history came from these lands. Figures whose knowledge shaped entire schools of thought, whose writings are still studied today, and whose influence continues to guide millions. This connection is not accidental. It was hinted at in the words of the Prophet, "Peace and blessings be upon him," in a narration that carries a powerful message about the future role of the people of Persia. He said that if faith were suspended high in the sky, far beyond the reach of ordinary effort, men from these people would still be able to attain it. This statement is not simply praise. It is a recognition of potential, a glimpse into the future contributions of a people who would carry knowledge, preserve understanding, and play a key role in the development of Islamic civilization. And when we look back at history, we see that this was fulfilled in remarkable ways. Scholars of Hadith, jurisprudence, theology, and many other fields emerged from these regions, shaping the intellectual foundation of Islam as we know it today. So when narrations mention the East, or regions like Khorasan, they are not pointing to an empty or insignificant place. And they are pointing to lands that have always been active, influential, and deeply connected to the story of Islam. This adds weight to the discussion, but it also adds responsibility. Because recognizing the importance of a region does not mean assigning every major event there a prophetic meaning. It means understanding its role with balance, appreciating its history, and being careful not to overextend interpretations beyond what is supported by authentic evidence. There is also another layer to consider. The East, particularly regions associated with Persia, and Khorasan, has often been a place where major change begins. Not always in the context of end-time signs, but in terms of intellectual movements, political shifts, and social transformations. This pattern can create a psychological expectation. So people begin to associate any major development from that region with something larger, something destined, something connected to prophecy. But Islam teaches us to distinguish between patterns of history and signs of the unseen. Not every recurring theme is a divine signal. Some are simply the natural unfolding of human societies, and this is where maturity in understanding becomes essential. A believer does not deny the possibility of signs, but a believer also does not rush to claim them. There is a discipline in waiting, a strength in holding back judgment until clarity is reached. Because when the true signs appear, they will not need to be forced into interpretation. They will align clearly with what has been authentically transmitted. They will fit into the broader picture described by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, without contradiction or uncertainty. So when we hear about Persia today, when we see events unfolding in regions that once carried the weight of empires and revolutions, we should feel a sense of awareness, not anxiety. We should reflect, not react impulsively. We should remember that these lands have always been part of the story, but they are not the entire story. The appearance of the Mahdi is not tied to a single event, a single location, or a single moment. It is part of a sequence, a larger unfolding that includes the condition of the world, the state of the people, and the alignment of multiple signs that come together in a way that leaves little room for doubt. And perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this is a simple but powerful truth. The purpose of these narrations is not to turn believers into observers of speculation, constantly trying to decode the world like a puzzle. The purpose is to ground us, to remind us that history moves according to the will of Allah, and that our role is not to predict every step, but to be ready when the truth becomes clear. Because in the end, it will not be those who guessed correctly who succeed, but those who remained sincere, grounded, and firmly connected to what is authentic. There is a deeper layer to this entire discussion that often goes unnoticed, and it is not found in banners, movements, or geographic directions. It is found in the condition of the world itself. Because the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not describe the coming of Al-Mahdi as an isolated event. He placed it within a very specific atmosphere, and a very particular state of humanity. And if that atmosphere is not understood, then every attempt to identify the signs becomes incomplete. The narrations describe a time when dhulm becomes widespread, not in one region, not in one nation, but across the earth. Injustice becomes so normal that people begin to accept it as part of life. Truth becomes blurred, trust becomes fragile, and divisions among people deepen to a point where unity feels almost impossible. This is not a minor detail. It is the backdrop against which the appearance of Al-Mahdi takes place. Think about that carefully. The sign is not just a man appearing, the sign is a world that has reached a certain level of imbalance. A world where leadership fails to uphold justice, where power is often used for control rather than fairness, and where ordinary people begin to feel that there is no clear path back to what is right. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described that Al-Mahdi will fill the earth with justice as it had been filled with oppression. This comparison is powerful. It means that the level of justice he brings will be as widespread and as noticeable as the injustice that existed before him. And that tells us something very important. Before his arrival, the scale of dhulm will not be small or hidden. It will be visible, undeniable, and deeply felt by people across different societies. This is why focusing only on isolated events like movements in the East or the rise of certain groups can be misleading if we ignore the larger picture. The true sign is not a single incident. It is a global condition. It is a moment in history where the imbalance becomes so clear that the need for justice is not just a desire, but a desperate necessity. And when that moment arrives, the appearance of Al-Mahdi will not feel random. It will feel like a response, like something that fits perfectly into the state of the world at that time. But here is where things become even more serious. because the same narrations that describe this period also warn about confusion. They warn about trials that shake people's understanding, about situations where truth and falsehood are mixed in ways that are not always easy to separate. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, spoke about times when a person may go to sleep as a believer and wake up in a different state, not because of sudden disbelief, but because of the intensity of the trials around them. This is not just about physical hardship. It is about intellectual and spiritual challenges, about being exposed to ideas, claims, and movements that can pull a person in different directions. And this is where the danger of misinterpretation becomes real. Because when people are already living in a time of confusion, they become more vulnerable to attaching themselves to anything that appears to offer clarity. If a group rises and claims to be connected to prophecy, if a movement presents itself as the fulfillment of a long-awaited sign, it can attract those who are searching for certainty, especially if that claim is wrapped in language that sounds religious, that references narrations, and that seems to connect with what people have heard before. But without proper knowledge, without a clear understanding of what is authentic and what is not, it becomes easy to be misled. History has already shown us this pattern more than once. There have been individuals who claim to be Al-Mahdi. There have been groups that use the idea of black banners or other signs to gather followers. Some of them were sincere but mistaken. Others were deliberate in their claims, using religion as a tool to gain influence. And in each case, the result was confusion, division, and sometimes even harm. This is why scholars have always emphasized that belief in the signs of the end times must be grounded in strong evidence, not in emotional reactions, not in popular narratives, but in what has been clearly and authentically transmitted. There is also a psychological aspect to this. When people expect a major event, so they begin to interpret everything through that expectation, they look for patterns, they connect unrelated details, and they build a narrative that feels convincing, even if it is not supported by solid evidence. This is not unique to religious discussions. It is part of human nature. But when it comes to matters of faith, the consequences are much more serious, because it can lead to misplaced trust, to following the wrong path, and to losing sight of what truly matters. And what truly matters, as the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, repeatedly emphasized, is staying firm upon guidance. Not predicting the future, not identifying every sign before it fully unfolds, but maintaining sincerity, holding on to truth, and being cautious in times of uncertainty. The companions of the prophet did not spend their time trying to match every event to a prophecy. They focused on understanding, on worship, on building strong foundations in their faith, and because of that, they were able to navigate even the most difficult times with clarity. This is the balance that is needed today. Awareness without obsession, reflection without assumption, belief without exaggeration. When we hear about events in the East, when we see movements that seem to echo certain narrations, we acknowledge the possibility, but we do not rush to conclusions. We remember that not every resemblance is a fulfillment, and not every powerful event is a sign of the end times. We remind ourselves that the true signs, when they come together, will align in a way that leaves little room for doubt. And perhaps the most important safeguard in all of this is knowledge. Not just information, but knowledge that is rooted in authentic sources, understood through the lens of scholars who dedicated their lives to preserving and explaining the teachings of Islam. Because without that foundation, even sincere intentions can lead to incorrect conclusions. A person may genuinely want to understand, may genuinely want to prepare, but without the right tools, they can be drawn into narratives that do not hold up under careful examination. So the question is not just what is happening in the world, but how we respond to it. Do we react quickly, driven by emotion and speculation, or do we pause, reflect, and seek clarity? Do we attach ourselves to every new claim, or do we measure it against what is firmly established? Do we allow confusion to pull us in different directions? Or do we anchor ourselves in what is thought and reliable? Because in the end, the trials before the appearance of Al-Mahdi are not just external, they are internal as well. They test patience, they test understanding, and they test sincerity. And those who pass these tests are not necessarily the ones who identify every sign early, but the ones who remain steady, who do not get carried away by every wave, and who hold firmly to what is true even when the world around them feels uncertain. When we strip away speculation, emotional interpretation, and the noise of modern discussion, what remains is something far more powerful and far more reliable. There are elements about the coming of Al-Mahdi that are not debated, not uncertain, and not built on weak or disputed narrations. These are the foundations that scholars have agreed upon, preserved through authentic Hadith and taught with clarity for generations. And if a person truly wants to understand the signs without falling into confusion, this is where their attention must begin. Because certainty in Islam is not built on what sounds convincing, but on what is firmly established. Among the clearest realities is that Al-Mahdi will not emerge in a time of stability and comfort. His appearance is directly tied to a world that has lost its balance. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described a time when the earth would be filled with oppression, and then a man would come who would restore justice in a way that is just as widespread. This is not a small reform, not a limited improvement in one region, but a transformation that affects the world at a level that people can feel and recognize. It is a restoration that stands in direct contrast to the Dhulm that came before it. This alone tells us that his role is not symbolic. It is real, practical, and deeply connected to the lives of people. Another point that is firmly established is that Al-Mahdi will be from the lineage of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. He will not be an unknown figure with no connection to the prophetic family. His lineage is part of his identity, and it is one of the ways he will be recognized. His name will match the name of the Prophet, and his father's name will match the name of the Prophet's father. These details are not random. They are precise markers meant to prevent false claims and confusion. Throughout history, there have been individuals who claimed to be the Mahdi, but when their claims were examined against these clear descriptions, they did not align. There is also the manner in which he will be recognized, and this is something that often surprises people. He will not begin by declaring himself publicly as the Mahdi in a way that forces people to accept him. Instead, he will be recognized by others, particularly by righteous individuals who understand the signs and see in him what has been described. There is a narration that speaks about people giving him allegiance near the Kaaba, even as he initially hesitates. This moment is significant because it shows that his leadership is not built on self-promotion or ambition. It is something that unfolds naturally, guided by the will of Allah, and supported by those who recognize truth when they see it. And when we look at these confirmed elements together, something becomes very clear. The appearance of Al-Mahdi is not tied to a single dramatic event that can be easily identified in isolation. It is part of a sequence, a larger unfolding that includes the condition of the world, the identity of the man himself, the recognition by believers, and the alignment of multiple signs that come together in a way that forms a complete picture. This is why focusing on one detail, such as black banners or a specific region, without considering the rest, can lead to misunderstanding. Because the true sign is not one piece of the puzzle, it is the entire picture coming together. Now when we turn to other authentic signs that precede his appearance, we begin to see that the Prophet, so peace and blessings be upon him, gave a broader framework that helps us understand the timing and context. There are narrations that speak about disputes among Muslims, particularly over leadership. There are mentions of instability in certain regions, of conflicts that weaken unity and create uncertainty. These are not vague ideas, they are specific conditions that reflect a world struggling with division and a lack of clear direction. One of the most striking elements mentioned in authentic narrations is the situation around the Kaaba. There is mention of a man who will seek refuge there, and people will come to him and give him allegiance. This moment is not hidden or symbolic. It takes place in one of the most sacred locations in Islam, in a way that is visible and significant. And it is a moment that connects directly to the identity of Al-Mahdi and marks a turning point in events. And this is important because it shows that the signs are not all distant or abstract. Some of them are grounded in clear physical events that will be recognized by people. There are also narrations about armies, about movements, and about confrontations that occur around this time. But again, what stands out is not just the events themselves, but how they connect to the broader picture. They are not random conflicts. They are part of a sequence that leads toward a larger transformation. And this is where the difference between speculation and knowledge becomes clear. Speculation focuses on isolated events and tries to assign meaning to them. Knowledge looks at the full framework and understands how each piece fits into the whole. And this brings us to a critical point that cannot be ignored. In times of uncertainty, people naturally look for signs. They want to understand what is happening, to make sense of the world, to feel that they are not lost in the flow of events. This desire is not wrong. It is human, but it becomes dangerous when it is not guided by knowledge. Because without guidance, people can begin to see signs where there are none, or miss the true signs when they appear because they have been focused on the wrong things. This is why the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not just describe the signs, he also guided people on how to approach them. He emphasized patience, clarity, and staying firm upon what is true. He did not encourage people to chase every rumor or to constantly try to decode the future. Instead, he focused on building strong foundations in faith, so that when the time comes, people are ready, not because they predicted every detail, but because they are grounded in truth. And when you reflect on this deeply, you realize that the greatest preparation for the coming of Al-Mahdi is not identifying external signs, but strengthening internal certainty. Because when a person is firmly rooted in authentic knowledge, when their understanding is clear, and when their heart is connected to guidance, they are not easily shaken by confusion. They do not get carried away by every new claim or every dramatic interpretation. They remain steady, observing, reflecting, and waiting with patience. This does not mean ignoring what is happening in the world. It means engaging with it wisely. It means recognizing that some events may have significance while others may not, and that the difference between the two is not determined by how dramatic they appear, but by how well they align with what has been authentically transmitted. It means accepting that not everything needs an immediate answer, and that sometimes the correct response is to wait until clarity becomes undeniable. Because when the true signs come together, they will not require forced interpretation. They will align naturally with what has been described. The identity of Al-Mahdi will be clear. The condition of the world will match the descriptions. The sequence of events will unfold in a way that makes sense within the framework of authentic narrations. And at that point, the question will not be whether this is the sign, but whether we are ready to respond to it. Until that moment, the responsibility remains the same: to seek knowledge, to stay grounded, and to approach every claim with balance and caution. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the seriousness of the subject. Because this is not just about understanding the future, it is about preserving the integrity of belief, protecting ourselves from confusion, and ensuring that when the truth becomes clear, we are among those who recognize it without hesitation. When people look at the world today, especially at regions that have long been tied to history, power, and transformation, it is almost impossible not to feel a sense of intensity building beneath the surface. The East, particularly lands associated with Persia and its surrounding regions, continues to draw attention. And political tensions rise and fall, alliances shift, conflicts emerge and settle only to return again in new forms. For someone who has heard narrations about the East, about movements, about change, it can feel as though everything is pointing towards something larger. It creates a quiet question in the mind that refuses to disappear. Is this it, or is this just another cycle in a world that has always been unstable? But this is where clarity becomes more important than curiosity. Because Islam does not teach us to interpret every major event as a sign of the end. It teaches us to distinguish between what is part of the natural course of history and what has been specifically identified as a sign through authentic revelation. The difference between the two is not always obvious at first glance, and especially in a time where information spreads rapidly and narratives are built quickly. But the distinction is essential. Without it, a person can begin to see patterns that are not truly there, or assign meanings to events that were never meant to carry that weight. The reality is that the world has always experienced conflict. There have always been regions of tension, periods of upheaval, and moments where people believed they were living at the edge of something final. Even in earlier centuries, people looked at their circumstances and felt that the signs must be unfolding. Wars broke out, leadership changed, injustice spread, and many believed that they were witnessing the beginning of the end. Yet history continued. Generations passed, and what felt like the final chapter turned out to be part of a much longer story. This does not mean that the signs will not come. It means that not every intense moment is the sign itself. And this is where patience becomes a form of understanding. A person must be able to observe the world without rushing to conclusions, to recognize the seriousness of events without immediately assigning them prophetic significance. Because once a person begins to connect every major event to the signs of the end times, they lose the ability to see clearly. Everything becomes exaggerated, every development becomes loaded with meaning, and eventually confusion replaces certainty. And yet there is something undeniable about the feeling that the world is shifting. Not necessarily in a way that confirms a specific sign, but in a way that reminds us that nothing remains stable forever. Systems change. Power moves. Men and what once seemed permanent can disappear in a matter of years. This constant transformation is itself a reminder that the world is temporary, that it is not designed to remain fixed. And perhaps this is one of the deeper purposes behind the narrations about the end times. Not to make people obsess over specific events, but to remind them that the world is moving toward a conclusion, even if that conclusion is not immediately visible. So when we look at Persia or any region in the East today, we do so with awareness, but not with assumption. We recognize its historical significance, we acknowledge its role in shaping events, but we do not rush to declare that it must be tied to a specific prophecy. Because the truth is that if something truly is a sign, it will not need to be forced into interpretation. It will align clearly with what has been authentically described, and it will fit into the broader framework without contradiction. And this leads to a more important question, one that shifts the focus away from external events and brings it back to something much closer. If the signs are not meant to be chased endlessly, then what are they meant to do for us? What is their real purpose? Because the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not share these narrations so that people could spend their lives trying to predict the exact moment of their fulfillment. He shared them so that people would be prepared. Prepared not just in knowledge, but in character, in faith, and in their relationship with Allah. Preparation in Islam is not about knowing every detail of what will happen. It is about being ready when it happens. And that readiness is built long before any sign becomes visible. It is built through consistency in worship, through sincerity in intention, through seeking knowledge that is rooted in authenticity, and through developing a qalb that is not easily shaken by confusion. Because when the time comes, those who are prepared will not be the ones who guessed correctly, but the ones who remained firm when others became uncertain. There is a subtle but powerful difference between those who are constantly trying to decode the future and those who are focused on strengthening themselves. The first group often moves from one interpretation to another, always searching, always adjusting their understanding based on the latest event. The second group remains steady. They observe, they reflect. But their foundation does not shift with every new development. They understand that guidance is not found in speculation, but in what has been clearly revealed. And this steadiness is exactly what will be needed in the time before the appearance of Al-Mahdi. Because the narrations describe a period of trials, of confusion, of situations where things are not always what they seem. In such a time, the ability to remain grounded becomes more valuable than the ability to predict. A person who is grounded will not be easily misled by false claims, will not be drawn into movements that lack authenticity, and will not lose their direction when faced with uncertainty. This is why scholars have always emphasized that the best way to approach the signs of the end times is not through obsession, but through balance. To learn what is authentic, to understand the framework, and then to focus on living in a way that aligns with that knowledge. Because in the end, the purpose is not to identify every sign before it happens, but to be among those who respond correctly when it does. And as we come to the final reflection, everything begins to settle into a clearer perspective. The question of whether a great event in Persia signals the appearance of Al-Mahdi is not answered by looking at headlines or by connecting isolated narrations to current events. It is answered by returning to what is certain and acknowledging what is not. There is no clear, undisputed, authentic evidence that allows us to point to a specific event in that region today and say with confidence that it is the sign. What we have are narrations that require careful understanding, a history that teaches caution, and a present that invites reflection but does not demand conclusion. The real sign of the coming of Al-Mahdi is not hidden in ambiguity. It is described in a way that, when it unfolds, will be recognized by those who have taken the time to understand. It will not depend on speculation. It will not require people to stretch interpretations. It will align with the descriptions given by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in a way that brings clarity rather than confusion. Until that moment arrives, the responsibility remains simple, but not easy. To stay connected to what is authentic, to resist the urge to jump to conclusions, and to focus on what truly matters. Because in the end, the greatest success will not belong to those who identified the signs earliest, but to those who remained sincere, patient, and firmly grounded in their faith. And when the time comes, that sincerity will be the difference between those who recognize the truth and those who are still searching for it.